The red light flashed as Patrick Roy slammed his blocker into the boards. The Montreal Forum fell silent. It was December 2nd, 1995, and Roy had just been left in net to surrender 9 goals against the Detroit Red Wings. When he was finally pulled in the second period, Roy skated directly to team president Ronald Corey sitting behind the bench. He leaned in and said the words that would change hockey history. "This is my last game in Montreal." 4 days later, Roy was traded to Colorado. This moment encapsulated everything about Patrick Roy: fiery, proud, and absolutely unwilling to back down from anyone. It wasn't just a career-defining moment. It was a perfect illustration of the competitive fire that made him one of hockey's most dominant figures. While many great athletes are remembered for their skills, Roy is remembered just as much for his unbreakable will and refusal to surrender. Patrick Roy didn't just stop pucks. He changed what it meant to be a goaltender in the NHL. Before Roy, goalies were often seen as a quiet last line of defense. After Roy, they became warriors, competitors, and in many cases, the emotional leaders of their teams. His 4 Stanley Cups split between 2 franchises, 3 Conn Smythe trophies as playoff MVP, and 551 career wins tell only part of the story. The complete picture requires understanding the rivalries that fueled him. These rivalries weren't just against opposing shooters trying to score on him. They extended to fellow goaltenders competing for the title of NHL's best, coaches trying to solve him, and perhaps most significantly, the rivalry within himself, the constant push for perfection that drove his preparation and performance. Roy didn't just compete against others. He competed against the very idea of what a goaltender could accomplish. Throughout his 18-year NHL career spanning from 1985 to 2003, Roy's battles on and off the ice created some of hockey's most memorable moments. From his legendary stare-downs with shooters to his on-ice confrontations with other goalies, Roy never backed down from a challenge. These weren't just flashes of temper. They were calculated psychological tactics from players who understood that goaltending was as much mental as physical. What made Roy's rivalry so compelling wasn't just their intensity, but their impact. They didn't merely add color to NHL history. They fundamentally changed how the game was played. They forced shooters to adjust their approaches, inspired a generation of young goaltenders to embrace both technical excellence and competitive fire, and elevated the entire sport by pushing opponents to their limits. This is the story of those rivalries, the battles that defined not just Patrick Roy's legendary career, but an entire era of hockey. It's about more than wins and losses. It's about how one player's refusal to back down transformed position and left an indelible mark on the sport he dominated for nearly 2 decades. Patrick Roy's legendary competitive spirit wasn't something that suddenly appeared when he reached the NHL. The roots of his warrior mentality began in the Quebec City suburb of St. Foy, where he was born on October 5, 1965. The son of Michel and Barbara Roy, young Patrick grew up in a hockey-loving household where competition was valued. His father worked as a sales representative for a paper company, but had once been offered a minor league contract with the Detroit Red Wings. Though Michel never made the NHL, he passed his passion for the game to his son. From an early age, Patrick displayed an unusual intensity when it came to competition. Neighborhood street hockey games weren't just casual fun for Roy, they were battles to be won. Friends and family members recall how even as a child, Patrick hated to lose at anything, whether it was hockey, board games, or backyard competitions. This fierce determination sometimes alienated other children who didn't match his competitive drive, but it was laying the groundwork for his future success. When Roy began playing organized hockey, he didn't immediately gravitate toward the goaltender position. He played forward until age 7 when, during a team practice, the regular goalie was absent. Roy volunteered to fill in, and despite the crude equipment available to him at the time, he found he enjoyed the position. The responsibility of being the last line of defense appealed to his personality. More importantly, being in goal put him at the center of the game's decisive moments, exactly where his competitive nature craved to be. Throughout his youth hockey years, Roy studied the techniques of NHL goaltenders, particularly focusing on Montreal Canadiens star Ken Dryden. Roy wasn't the most athletically gifted young player, but coaches noted his exceptional focus and work ethic. When he failed or allowed goals in practice, he didn't become discouraged. He became determined. Each failure seemed to fuel his resolve rather than diminish it. By his early teens, Roy had developed a reputation as a technically sound goalie who played with unusual intensity for someone his age. His junior hockey career began with the Granby Bisons of the Quebec Major Junior Hockey League, QMJHL, in 1982. It was during these formative years that Roy's trademark intensity and competitive approach began to fully emerge. Teammates from this period recall Roy's meticulous preparation before games and his fierce reaction to losses. He wasn't just playing to stop pucks, he was playing to win psychological battles with opposing shooters. Even then, he had begun developing his famous stare-down technique after making big saves, sending a clear message to opponents that they weren't going to beat him again. Despite his obvious talent and determination, Roy wasn't immediately recognized as a future NHL star. In fact, he wasn't selected until the third round, 51st overall, of the 1984 NHL entry draft by the Montreal Canadiens. This perceived slight became another source of motivation for Roy, who would later admit that being passed over by so many teams in the early rounds fueled his desire to prove everyone wrong. After being drafted, Roy returned to junior hockey where he led the Granby Bisons to a Memorial Cup appearance. His performance caught the attention of the Canadiens' management, but it was more than just his technical skills that impressed them. It was his approach to the game, the way he challenged shooters, the way he bounced back from bad goals, and the way he seemed to elevate his play in the biggest moments. These were the earliest professional signs of the never-back-down attitude that would define his NHL career. By the time he was ready to make the jump to professional hockey, Roy had developed not just the technical foundation of a good goaltender, but the psychological makeup of a great one. He brought with him an unshakable confidence, a relentless work ethic, and a competitive fire that would soon make him one of the most formidable and feared goaltenders in NHL history. The origins of the Warrior had taken shape, and the hockey world was about to feel its full impact. Patrick Roy's arrival in Montreal came with little fanfare. When he joined the Canadiens for the 1985-86 season, he was expected to serve as a backup to veteran goaltender Doug Soetard. Few could have predicted that this 20-year-old rookie would not only claim the starting job by mid-season, but lead the storied franchise to a Stanley Cup championship. Roy's emergence during the 1986 playoff run revealed the first glimpses of his extraordinary competitive nature on hockey's biggest stage. After securing the starting position, Roy backstopped the Canadiens through a challenging playoff journey. What stood out wasn't just his technical prowess, but his remarkable composure under pressure. While many young goaltenders would crumble under the weight of Montreal's championship expectations, Roy seemed to thrive on it. He posted a 1.92 goals against average across 20 playoff games, culminating in a Stanley Cup final victory over the Calgary Flames. His performance earned him the Conn Smythe Trophy as playoff MVP, the youngest player ever to receive the honor at just 20 years old. The 1986 Cup run established Roy as Montreal's cornerstone, but also marked the beginning of his most significant rivalries. Elite goal scorers quickly recognized that beating Roy required more than just skill. It required breaking through his psychological armor. Players like Wayne Gretzky, Mario Lemieux, and Brett Hull found in Roy an opponent who wouldn't be intimidated by their reputations. Roy developed a particularly intense competitive relationship with Gretzky, whose Edmonton Oilers represented the offensive juggernaut against which Roy's defensive excellence would be measured. Between 1986 and 1993, Roy's reputation as a big-game performer grew alongside his list of rivals. His battles with the Boston Bruins became legendary, particularly during their playoff meetings. Bruins forward Cam Neely and Roy developed a fierce shooter-goalie rivalry that exemplified Roy's approach to the game. After making saves against Neely, Roy would often stare him down, sending a clear message that no matter how many times Neely tried, Roy would be there to stop him. The psychological warfare became a Roy trademark. The pinnacle of Roy's Montreal career came during the 1992-93 season. The Canadiens weren't considered serious cup contenders when the playoffs began, but Roy elevated his game to an almost mythical level. He led Montreal to an NHL record 10 consecutive overtime victories en route to the Stanley Cup. What made this run extraordinary wasn't just the wins, but how Roy achieved them. He posted a spectacular .929 save percentage, but more importantly, he seemed unbeatable in the most pressure-filled moments. During the 1993 Stanley Cup Final against Wayne Gretzky's Los Angeles Kings, Roy's competitive nature was on full display. Before Game 4, with Montreal leading the series 2-1, Kings coach Barry Melrose suggested that Roy was using illegal oversized equipment. Rather than becoming defensive, Roy responded with what became known as the wink. After making a crucial save on Tomas Sandstrom, Roy deliberately winked at the Kings bench, a psychological power move that demonstrated his unshakable confidence. Montreal won the game and eventually the series, securing Roy's second Stanley Cup. The years between these two championships solidified Roy's reputation not just as an elite goaltender, but as a fierce competitor who thrived on confrontation. He regularly engaged in verbal exchanges with opposing players, celebrated big save with theatrical flourishes, and never shied away from defending his crease. This approach earned him both admirers and detractors, but undeniably established him as one of the most mentally tough players of his generation. Roy's time in Montreal ended dramatically with the infamous incident against Detroit in 1995, but his legacy with the franchise was already secure. He had transformed from an unheralded draft pick to a two-time Stanley Cup champion and the emotional leader of hockey's most storied franchise. More importantly, he had established a competitive template that would define the remainder of his career: a refusal to back down, a psychological approach to goaltending, and an absolute certainty that he would prevail in the game's biggest moments. The foundation of the legend was firmly in place, setting the stage for even more intense rivalries to come. The trade that sent Patrick Roy from Montreal to Colorado in December 1995 didn't just change the trajectory of his career. It placed him directly into what would become the NHL's most heated rivalry of the late 1990s. The Colorado Avalanche and Detroit Red Wings rivalry would define an era of hockey, and at its emotional center stood Roy, whose battles with Detroit's players and goaltenders created some of the sport's most unforgettable moments. Roy's arrival in Colorado immediately transformed the recently relocated franchise into a Stanley Cup contender. In his first season with the team, he led the Avalanche to the 1996 Stanley Cup Championship, defeating the Florida Panthers in the final. However, it was during the Western Conference Finals against Detroit that the seeds of what would become hockey's most intense rivalry were planted. Colorado eliminated Detroit in 6 games, with Roy outdueling Wings goaltender Mike Vernon. This defeat stung the Red Wings, who had finished the regular season with an NHL record 62 wins, only to fall short of the Stanley Cup final. The rivalry exploded on March 26, 1997, in a game that would become known as Bloody Wednesday or the Fight Night of the Joe. The tensions that had been building between the teams erupted into one of the most violent games in modern NHL history. The flashpoint came when Detroit's Darren McCarty sought revenge against Colorado's Claude Lemieux for a hit that had injured Chris Draper in the previous year's playoffs. As multiple fights broke out across the ice, Roy, never one to watch from the sidelines, skated out of his crease to confront Detroit's enforcer Brendan Shanahan. In the chaos that followed, Roy found himself face-to-face with Detroit goaltender Mike Vernon. The two goaltenders engaged in a rare goalie fight that became one of the most iconic images of the rivalry. Though Vernon got the better of Roy in the physical exchange, the fight cemented Roy's status as more than just a skilled goaltender. He was a warrior who would defend his teammates without hesitation. Detroit would go on to win that game and, eventually, the Stanley Cup that season, adding another layer to the brewing feud. The goaltending rivalry continued the following season when Chris Osgood replaced Vernon as Detroit starter. On April 1st, 1998, in another heated contest between the teams, Roy and Osgood engaged in their own goalie fight. This time, Roy skated to center ice to challenge Osgood directly, showing that the competitive fire burned as hot as ever. Though the Red Wings would again win the Stanley Cup that year, Roy's willingness to confront any opponent, regardless of position, became a defining characteristic of the rivalry. Beyond the physical confrontations, Roy's rivalry with Detroit was defined by the elite scorers he faced. Steve Yzerman, Sergei Fedorov, and Brendan Shanahan represented the core of Detroit's offensive attack, and every save Roy made against them carried extra significance. The psychological battles between Roy and these star players became a crucial subplot in every Avalanche Red Wings matchup. After big saves, Roy would often add an extra flourish, a glove wave or a stare, specifically designed to frustrate Detroit shooters. The rivalry reached its competitive peak during the 1999 and 2000 playoffs, with the teams meeting in consecutive Western Conference semifinals. Colorado, led by Roy's goaltending, prevailed in both series, exacting a measure of revenge for previous defeats. During these intense playoff battles, Roy's competitiveness seemed to reach new heights. His focus and intensity during games against Detroit surpassed even his normally high standards, demonstrating just how personally he took these matchups. What made the Detroit rivalry particularly significant for Roy was how it showcased every dimension of his competitive personality. It featured the technical excellence that made him an elite goaltender, the psychological warfare he waged against opposing shooters, his willingness to physically defend his teammates, and his ability to elevate his performance when the stakes were highest. The rivalry wasn't just about wins and losses. It was about competitive pride and establishing dominance. By the time the intensity of the Colorado-Detroit rivalry began to fade in the early 2000s, it had produced countless memorable moments and firmly established itself as one of hockey's greatest feuds. For Roy, it represented perhaps the most complete expression of his never-back-down approach to hockey. Against Detroit, he had been called upon to be not just a goaltender but a team leader, an enforcer, and a psychological warrior. It was a challenge he embraced with characteristic intensity, further cementing his legacy as one of hockey's most competitive figures. While Patrick Roy's battles with the Detroit Red Wings showcased his willingness to defend his team at any cost, his rivalries with fellow elite goaltenders revealed a different aspect of his competitive nature. Throughout the 1990s and early 2000s, Roy engaged in what hockey observers came to call the Goalie Wars, ongoing competitions with contemporaries Martin Brodeur, Dominik Hasek, and Ed Belfour for the title of NHL's best goaltender. These rivalries weren't marked by physical confrontations, but by a relentless pursuit of excellence and psychological one-upmanship. The most compelling of these goaltending rivalries developed between Roy and New Jersey's Martin Brodeur. Their contrasting styles made the competition particularly fascinating. Roy was the architect of the butterfly style that revolutionized goaltending, while Brodeur employed a more traditional stand-up approach supplemented by extraordinary puck-handling skills. Beyond technique, their personalities diverged sharply. Brodeur was known for his calm, almost casual demeanor in net, while Roy's intensity and theatrical flair defined his approach to the position. The Roy-Brodeur rivalry reached its peak during the 2001 Stanley Cup final, when Roy's Colorado Avalanche faced Brodeur's New Jersey Devils. The series pitted the two greatest goaltenders of their generation against each other, with championship on the line. Roy, then 35, was seeking his fourth Stanley Cup, while Brodeur, 6 years younger, was aiming for his third. The 7-game series became a masterclass in goaltending, with both men making spectacular saves. Ultimately, Roy prevailed as Colorado won Game 7 by a score of 3-1, with Roy stopping 25 of 26 shots. In the traditional post-series handshake line, the brief exchange between the two goaltending titans spoke volumes about their mutual respect amid fierce competition. While Brodeur represented a generational rival, Roy's competition with Dominik Hasek was defined by dramatically different approaches to goaltending. Hasek's unorthodox, almost improvisational style stood in stark contrast to Roy's technical precision. When Hasek emerged as a dominant force with the Buffalo Sabres in the mid-1990s, winning consecutive Hart trophies as NHL MVP in 1997 and 1998, he presented a direct challenge to Roy's status as the game's premier goaltender. Roy seemed to take Hasek's ascension personally, raising his game whenever they faced each other. The rivalry intensified when Hasek joined the Detroit Red Wings in 2001, adding another layer to the already heated Colorado-Detroit feud. Though the two rarely engaged directly, their performances were constantly measured against each other by fans, media, and seemingly by the goaltenders themselves. Each spectacular save by one seemed to demand an answer from the other. Their different approaches to the position sparked endless debates among hockey fans about the right way to play goal, with Roy and Hasek serving as the ideological standard-bearers for their respective techniques. The third significant goaltending rival for Roy was Chicago's Ed Belfour, whose fiery temperament most closely mirrored Roy's own. Like Roy, Belfour approached goaltending with an intensity that sometimes boiled over into emotional displays. Their similarities made their meetings particularly charged, as though each was facing competitive reflection of himself. When Belfour later joined the Dallas Stars, his teams engaged in several playoff battles with Roy's Avalanche, adding a team dimension to their personal rivalry. What distinguished Roy in these goaltending rivalries was his psychological approach. He understood that goaltending excellence wasn't measured solely by statistics but by moments, key saves in crucial situations that changed the momentum of games and series. Roy seemed to have an uncanny ability to deliver these momentum-shifting performances precisely when they would most directly challenge the reputation of a rival goaltender. His famous declaration that he couldn't hear Jeremy Roenick's criticism because his 2 Stanley Cup rings were plugging his ears, later updated to include his additional championships, exemplified how Roy used psychological tactics to assert dominance in these rivalries. As these goaltending wars played out across the NHL, they elevated the position to unprecedented prominence. No longer were goaltenders seen merely as the last line of defense. They had become the cornerstone pieces around which championship teams were built. Roy, Brodeur, Hasek, and Belfour pushed each other to new heights of excellence, with each man's achievements compelling the others to respond. For Roy, these rivalries provided a perfect stage to demonstrate that his never-back-down approach applied not just to opposing shooters or teams, but to anyone who would challenge his status as hockey's goaltending king. The legacy of these goaltending rivalries extends far beyond the statistics and championships accumulated by each man. They fundamentally changed how the position was played, evaluated, and valued throughout the hockey world. And at the center of this transformation stood Patrick Roy, whose competitive fire burned brightest when facing those few goaltenders who could legitimately challenge his throne. Patrick Roy's transition from legendary goaltender to NHL coach in 2015 marked a new chapter in his competitive story, but the fundamental character traits remained unchanged. When the Colorado Avalanche named him head coach and vice president of hockey operations, Roy brought the same intensity, tactical understanding, and psychological approach that had defined his playing career. His coaching rivalries quickly demonstrated that Roy behind the bench was every bit as competitive as Roy between pipes. From his very first game as an NHL coach, Roy made it clear that his fiery temperament hadn't cooled in retirement. In Colorado's season opener against the Anaheim Ducks, Roy nearly toppled a glass partition separating the team benches as he confronted Ducks coach Bruce Boudreau in the final seconds of a lopsided Avalanche victory. The incident stemmed from a late hit on Colorado rookie Nathan MacKinnon. Roy's explosive reaction sent an unmistakable message throughout the league. He would defend his players with the same ferocity he had shown as a goaltender. The NHL fined Roy $10,000, but the psychological impact was worth far more to his team. This opening salvo established a template for Roy's coaching rivalries. Unlike many former players who adopted a more reserved approach when moving to coaching, Roy embraced confrontation as a tactical weapon. He understood that coaching wasn't just about systems and strategy, but about setting an emotional tone. His most heated coaching rivalries developed with opponents who represented differing philosophical approaches to the game, particularly those who prioritized analytical systems over emotional engagement. The contrast between Roy's emotion-driven coaching style and the more analytically focused approaches of coaches like Mike Babcock of Detroit and Joel Quenneville of Chicago created fascinating tactical chess matches. While these coaches relied heavily on structure systems and possession metrics, Roy emphasized aggressive, risk-taking hockey that mirrored his own playing philosophy. These philosophical differences turned regular season games into showcases for competing visions of hockey's future. Roy's rivalry with Minnesota Wild coach Mike Yeo became particularly noteworthy during their first-round playoff series in 2014. After Colorado took a 2-0 series lead, Yeo made tactical adjustments that frustrated the Avalanche's attack. Rather than countering with his own system changes, Roy doubled down on an aggressive approach, encouraging his defensemen to join the rush despite the risks involved. This coaching chess match ultimately ended with Minnesota winning Game 7 in overtime, but Roy's willingness to embrace high-risk hockey rather than adopt a more conservative approach revealed how his competitive instincts shaped his coaching methodology. What made Roy's coaching rivalries unique was how personally he seemed to take tactical challenges. When opposing coaches found ways to neutralize Colorado's strategy, Roy viewed it not just as a coaching problem to solve, but as a direct competitive challenge to overcome. This personalization of coaching duels made every matchup against respected tacticians like Babcock, Quenneville, or Los Angeles' Darryl Sutter into must-watch events. The hockey world observed not just team against team, but contrasting hockey philosophies embodied by men with very different approaches to leadership. Roy's coaching tenure with Colorado lasted just 3 seasons, concluding when he resigned in August 2016, citing insufficient input in personnel decisions. His coaching record included 1 division title, a Jack Adams Award as NHL Coach of the Year in his rookie season, and a playoff appearance, but these achievements only hint at his impact. More significant was how he brought his competitive persona behind the bench, challenging conventional coaching wisdom and forcing opponents to prepare for both his tactical and psychological approach. After leaving Colorado, Roy returned to coaching with the Quebec Remparts of the Quebec Major Junior Hockey League, the same team he had coached before joining the Avalanche. In this role, away from the NHL spotlight, Roy continued to develop his coaching philosophy while mentoring young players. His approach remained distinctive, demanding excellence, emphasizing aggressive play, and above all, refusing to back down from challenges. Throughout his coaching career, Roy demonstrated that the competitive spirit that defined his playing days hadn't diminished. Whether facing rival coaches, challenging official decisions, or pushing his players to match his intensity, Roy brought the same never-back-down attitude to coaching that had made him a Hall of Fame goaltender. These coaching rivalries may have taken different forms than his playing rivalries, but they sprang from the same competitive wellspring, an absolute refusal to accept anything less than total victory. Beyond his battles with shooters, fellow goaltenders, and opposing coaches, Patrick Roy waged perhaps his most significant rivalry against an opponent no one else could see: himself. Throughout his career, Roy engaged in intense internal competition, constantly pushing against his own limitations and holding himself to standards few could comprehend. This inner rivalry, more than any external competition, defined his approach to hockey and drove his legendary career. Roy's internal competitive nature manifested most visibly in his pre-game routines. Long before sports psychology became mainstream in hockey, Roy developed elaborate mental preparation techniques that bordered on superstition. He would engage in precise visualization exercises, mentally rehearsing saves against specific opponents. He would speak to his goalposts, a practice that drew mockery from some observers but represented Roy's way of establishing complete ownership of his domain. Every aspect of his equipment had to be arranged perfectly, with specific routines governing how he prepared his gear before games. Behind these rituals lay a mind engaged in constant self-evaluation and self-competition. Roy was known for reviewing game footage with obsessive attention to detail, identifying minor technical flaws invisible to most observers. After allowing goals, even in victories, Roy would spend hours analyzing what he could have done differently. This relentless self-criticism wasn't about dwelling on failures, but about pursuing a level of technical perfection that could only exist in Roy's mind. He wasn't competing against other goaltender standards, but against an idealized version of goaltending excellence that he alone could envision. The psychological warfare Roy waged against himself extended to how he handled adversity. After allowing bad goals, many goaltenders would visibly struggle with confidence. Roy, by contrast, often seemed to become more focused and determined. Teammates and coaches observed that Roy's ability to mentally reset after setbacks was perhaps his greatest strength. This wasn't just natural resilience, it was a carefully cultivated response system built on his internal competitive dialogue. Every soft goal allowed became not a reason for self-doubt but a challenge to prove his excellence on the next shot faced. Roy's inner rivalry was particularly evident in how he approached playoff hockey. His preparation intensified during postseasons, with teammates noting changes in his demeanor and focus. Roy seemed to enter a different mental state during playoffs, imposing additional pressure on himself beyond what the high-stakes games already provided. He embraced this self-imposed pressure rather than trying to minimize it, understanding that his best performances came when he channeled this internal intensity productively. What made Roy's inner rivalry particularly remarkable was how it evolved throughout his career. As a young goaltender in Montreal, his self-competition centered primarily on technical excellence and overcoming doubters. In his Colorado years, with his technical abilities firmly established, his inner rivalry shifted toward leadership and competitive legacy. The questions he seemed to ask himself changed from, "Can I stop this shot?" to, "Can I elevate this team in this moment?" His 3 Conn Smythe trophies as playoff MVP, spread across different decades and franchises, testified to how successfully he managed his evolving internal dialogue. Perhaps the clearest illustration of Roy's inner rivalry came in the 2001 Stanley Cup final against New Jersey. At 35 years old, Roy found himself facing a Devils team that had defeated his Avalanche in the 2000 conference finals. Colorado defenseman Ray Bourque, a 22-year veteran, was seeking his first championship before retirement. The narrative surrounding the series focused on winning for Bourque, but Roy approached the challenge with characteristic self-focused intensity. Before Game 7, he told teammates he felt more pressure for this game than any other in his career, not from external expectations, but from his own internal standards. His shutout performance through 2.5 periods helped secure Colorado's victory and revealed how Roy's most meaningful competition had always been against himself. The legacy of Roy's inner rivalry extends far beyond his individual achievements. It changed how goaltenders approach their position, introducing psychological preparation techniques now considered standard throughout hockey. Modern elite goaltenders like Carey Price, Henrik Lundqvist, and Marc-Andre Fleury have acknowledged Roy's influence not just on technical aspects of goaltending, but on the mental approach to the position. The visualization techniques, the positioning work, the ability to reset after goals, all hallmarks of contemporary goaltending, can be traced to Roy's pioneering internal competitive process. For all his external battles against shooters, goalies, and coaches, Patrick Roy's greatest rivalry and his most significant victory came in the arena only he could access: his own mind. This inner competition pushed him beyond conventional limits and established a legacy that transformed not just records and statistics, but the very way his position is played and understood. Patrick Roy's impact on hockey extends far beyond his impressive statistics and championship rings. His 551 wins, 4 Stanley Cups, and 3 Conn Smythe trophies only tell part of the story. The true measure of Roy's influence lies in how he permanently transformed the goaltending position and left an indelible mark on hockey culture. His legacy of never backing down continues to shape the sport long after his retirement in 2003. The most visible aspect of Roy's legacy is the technical revolution he spearheaded. While not the inventor of the butterfly style, Roy perfected and popularized this technique, making it the standard approach for generations of goaltenders that followed. Before Roy, goaltending emphasized a stand-up style with occasional dropping to the ice. Roy demonstrated that systematically taking away the bottom of the net with butterfly slides and precise positioning could dramatically improve save percentages. Visit any hockey rink today, from NHL arenas to local youth leagues, and you'll see goaltenders employing techniques Roy pioneered and refined throughout his career. Beyond technical innovation, Roy fundamentally changed how teams value goaltenders. Prior to Roy's emergence, teams built championship rosters around elite scorers and defensemen, with goaltenders often viewed as complementary pieces. Roy's ability to single-handedly alter playoff series demonstrated that an elite goaltender could be the cornerstone of a championship team. His 1986 and 1993 Stanley Cup runs with Montreal, where he elevated otherwise ordinary teams to championship status, provided a template for building around goaltending excellence. This shift in valuation continues today, with teams willing to invest significant salary cap resources in elite goaltenders who can replicate Roy's playoff-stealing performances. Roy's psychological approach to goaltending has proven equally influential. Modern goaltenders routinely employ the mental preparation techniques Roy pioneered, visualization exercises, controlled emotional responses to goals, and strategic use of confidence to intimidate shooters. His understanding that goaltending was as much mental as physical opened new dimensions for the position. Today's top goaltenders like Carey Price and Andrei Vasilevsky have acknowledged Roy's influence on how they approach the psychological aspects of the position, particularly in high-pressure situations. The current generation of NHL goaltenders carries Roy's competitive DNA in ways both obvious and subtle. Finland's Tuukka Rask adopted Roy's disciplined positional approach while adding modern refinements. Canada's Jordan Binnington channeled Roy's playoff intensity during St. Louis's 2019 Stanley Cup run. Russia's Sergei Bobrovsky borrowed from Roy's mental preparation playbook. These goaltenders, born as Roy's career was peaking, represent the global reach of his influence. They may never have met Roy personally, but their playing styles reflect his technical and psychological blueprint. Roy's impact extends beyond the crease to overall hockey culture. His refusal to back down from any challenge helped legitimize emotional intensity in a sport that had sometimes valued stoicism over visible passion. When Roy skated to center ice to confront another goaltender or stood up to protect teammates, he demonstrated that competitive fire could be channeled constructively. This emotional authenticity has become increasingly valued in modern hockey, with teams recognizing that controlled intensity can elevate performance without compromising discipline. Perhaps most significantly, Roy changed what it means to be a leader from the goaltender position. Traditionally, team leadership came from captains and veteran skaters, with goaltenders focusing solely on stopping pucks. Roy shattered this model, showing that goaltenders could drive team identity and competitive culture from between the pipes. His willingness to hold teammates accountable, challenge opponents, and set the emotional temperature for his team established a new leadership paradigm. Modern goaltenders like Carey Price in Montreal and Jonathan Quick during Los Angeles' championship runs have followed Roy's example, becoming the emotional centerpieces of their teams. Roy's coaching career, though briefer than his playing days, further extended his legacy of competitive intensity. The goaltenders he has mentored, particularly during his time with the Quebec Remparts in junior hockey, carry forward his technical knowledge and competitive philosophy. His coaching tree may not yet be extensive, but his influence on how goaltending is taught at development levels ensures his methodologies will shape players for generations to come. The enduring power of Roy's legacy lies in its multidimensional nature. He didn't just change how goaltenders stop pucks, he changed how they prepare, how they compete, how they lead, and how they measure success. He elevated the position from a specialized defensive role to the cornerstone of championship teams. Most importantly, he demonstrated that refusing to back down from any shooter, any team, any challenge could transform not just individual careers but an entire sport. Patrick Roy's place in hockey history transcends the traditional metrics of success. His 551 regular season wins, 4 Stanley Cup championships, and 3 Conn Smythe trophies as playoff MVP provide statistical validation of his greatness, but they capture only the outline of his impact. The complete picture emerges when we consider how Roy's competitive approach, his absolute refusal to back down from any challenge, redefined what it meant to be a goaltender in the National Hockey League. Roy arrived in an era when goaltenders were largely evaluated on technical proficiency and statistical consistency. He departed having transformed position into one where mental toughness, competitive fire, and psychological warfare became equally important tools. This transformation didn't happen through conscious intent, but through Roy's authentic expression of his competitive nature. Every stare down after a big save, every confrontation with an opposing player, every passionate display of emotion served to illustrate that goaltending could be, and perhaps should be, as much about competitive will as technical skill. The rivalries that defined Roy's career reveal the different dimensions of his competitive personality. His battles with Detroit showcase his willingness to defend teammates at any cost. His competitions with fellow elite goaltenders Brodeur, Hasek, and Belfour demonstrated his need to assert dominance over his direct peers. His coaching rivalries highlighted how his competitive philosophy extended beyond playing techniques to encompass an entire approach to hockey. And his inner rivalry, the constant push to exceed his own standards, revealed the psychological engine that drove 2 decades of excellence. The enduring lesson of Roy's career isn't about butterfly technique or positioning or even the 4 championships. It's about the power of unbreakable will when paired with elite talent. Roy wasn't always the most technically perfect goaltender in the league. At various points, others could claim greater statistical efficiency or physical tools. What set Roy apart was his absolute certainty that when the stakes were highest, he would find a way to prevail. This self-belief wasn't just internal motivation. It became a force that altered game outcomes, intimidated opponents, and inspired teammates. For the generation of hockey players and fans who witnessed Roy's career, the lasting image isn't a particular save or championship celebration. It's the figure in the crease, rising to full height after making a critical stop, staring down the shooter with unmistakable intensity, sending the message that had defined his career. "You will not beat me." This defiant stance, repeated countless times over 2 decades, didn't just win games and championships. It changed hockey's competitive culture. Patrick Roy's rivalries didn't just define his career. They elevated the entire sport. By refusing to back down from any challenge, whether from superstar scorers, fellow elite goaltenders, or his own exacting standards, Roy forced everyone around him to raise their level of competition. Opponents had to find new ways to score. Teammates had to match his intensity, and the hockey world had to reconsider what was possible from the goaltending position. In this way, Roy's greatest contribution to hockey wasn't just the games and championships he won, but how his competitive spirit pushed the entire sport forward, leaving it forever changed by his uncompromising will to prevail.